Hey there, and welcome to the Internal Comms Pro Value webinar. In this series, we'll be talking with the experts while celebrating the work that makes you an internal communicator pro. I'm Gina Morvek. It's safe to say that crisis communications has been a hot topic lately. Countless examples of both good, but mainly not so good, attempts of companies trying to communicate through a crisis are littered throughout social media. It might make you take a pause and wonder if your company can handle the heat when a big change comes your way. Today, we'll be talking with John Brown from DAT Freight and Analytics and David Oates from PR Security Service as they share how you can manage your own crisis comms plan and that it's never too late to get one started. All right, well, thank you, John and David, for joining us today. So, before we get started with the main questions, please just go ahead and give us your name, what you do, and just so our audience can get to know you.
Thank you, Gina. I'm very happy to be here. My name is John Brown. I've worked in corporate communications for 20 years. I have a broad experience in highly regulatory environments. So this includes the energy industry, mining, industrial infrastructure. And in all those cases, I've had to handle crisis communications.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Gina. Thanks so much. Yeah, my name is Dave Oates. I'm a crisis PR person. I have been in that profession for close to 30 years. Started as a Navy officer, turned Navy public affairs officer, where I cut my teeth in a wide range of crises, and then been in the private sector in some form or fashion for a little over 20 years, and I've had my own consulting practice for about 16 of those, and focused on crisis communications for nonprofits and corporate and a wide range of other entities for about the last five, but it certainly has been part of my practice and my professional development since my Navy days.
All right, well, that's perfect since today we're here to talk about crisis communications.
That's
So let's
right.
get started. So I think it's safe to say in the past couple of years, especially since 2020, there's been a lot of crisis communications going on. It seemed, especially in the past couple of years, it almost seems like there's been something new back to back to back to back. And just because of the types of crises that we saw and just the nature of communications between 2020 and now in 2022, I
hmm
think it's safe to say a lot of learnings were had in between that time. So I'd say, especially in that pocket, from what you saw, what would you say some of those key learnings were found with companies with how they responded to certain types of crises?
I think it has to do with where they think the crisis originates. A lot of organizations are still looking at the traditional news media as where those type of events they'll have to deal with occur. And I would submit to you, for most organizations, big and small, the crisis will start because of some comment that's made in an online review, blog site like medium.com, a social media post, or things like that, that if left unchecked will start to go viral and start to gain momentum and become the narrative if left unchecked. And then they play this reactive game where they'll default to what I think are the sort of tried and true methods that have gotten the C suite and founders and business owners where they're at, which is they either just try to ignore the comments or they argue in sometimes not so pleasant terms the points that are being raised. And it becomes this real vitriol diatribe that just elevates the anxiety in the conversation online and then just causes a bigger mess. But I would say the beginning one is they just don't see the crisis as it's developing until it becomes a full conflagration.
That's a great question. I think the main thing we've learned is that speed and accuracy is paramount. As we know, most breaking news is happening over social media. Often it's not a traditional news agency that might be breaking news. Depending on the circumstance, it could be a bystander who is on Twitter who is giving a live account of an event. And in those instances, you need to be able to respond within minutes. Every minute that a organization is not responding to a crisis, the narrative is being built in real time, and that could include some misinformation that you will eventually have to address. And so it's really about getting in front of that. And from an internal perspective, I think traditionally, it used to be thought that a organization, the primary focus was to get news to external audiences first. And I think in today's rapid-paced environment, you need to be giving information out simultaneously, and you need to make sure your employees are well informed, because they may become uh, informal spokespeople with their friends and neighbors, depending on the type of crisis it is. I can give you a recent example. I was a consultant for Excel Energy here in Colorado. They operate gas and electric operations in 8 states. But last winter, there was a rapid wildfire that encroached a urban area. It made national news. Over 1,000 structures were burned. People had to be quickly evacuated. And in that instance, moments did count, and there was you have to have a close coordination with not only your people, but then affiliated organizations. In this circumstance, it was getting rapid information out to our field employees, who would be the first responders to uh, address the electric and gas assets that were threatened, that needed to be taken out of service, but also coordinating with emergency personnel and the fire department, and the evacuation. And so in those instances, it was really important that the organization thought about the internal audiences as well external, simultaneously. And I think that's like the biggest change, is that is the speed in which you need to respond.
Mhm, mhm. And like you mentioned, there's a lot of moving factors when it comes, granted, for any communication, but especially for crisis comms. Like you said, multi-channels, your internal audience, the vast majority of people and where they're working, what type of news will they best be receptive to? And then, of course, as you also mentioned, there's no one size fits all for crisis comms. There's a bunch of different ones that you can encounter. So for an internal communicator who's maybe new to this, what are some steps that they could take to start crafting their maybe a basic crisis comms to get started?
Yes. Well, you really want to start before the crisis hits, and that really starts with a crisis assessment of your organization. So, on a bright sunny day like it is today, and hopefully it stays that for both of us, you want to get your stakeholders together and sit in a room and imagine what your worst days could look like. And the truth is, most organizations can come up with almost 90% or more of what would be a worst case scenario for them, be it a executive scandal, a natural disaster, it could be, a crime at the workplace. And what you want to do is strategically think about what your risk factors are with each of those, and then start pre-planning what your responses will be. In my best organizations, we would have pre-written um, responses, almost like an ad lib, where we knew, let's say it was an executive scandal. We could have a press release, an internal memo, a social media tweet all ready. We just had to plug and play, put into the facts of that specific thing. Again, this is about speed and accuracy, trying to be first, because for an organization to be able to manage their own crisis, they need to be out front. And again, going back to how it used to be and how it should be, or it today, it used to be when a crisis hit 10, 15 years ago, everyone would get into the war room. You had your attorneys and your executives and your security personnel, and everyone would sit there and debate, what can we say? Who should we say it to? And it could take hours for an organization to develop their official response. That is absolutely not acceptable in today's environment. Uh, if an organization is still operating in that sense, they will be already behind, and most likely they'll be doing damage control for most of their response, because by if you wait 2 to 3 hours, you're going to be responding to a lot of misinformation and narratives that have been started and constructed by or entities outside of your organization. So again, the first step is doing that assessment and then developing these responses. And when I say that, so once we get these pre-written responses that just have a few details that can be plugged in, you get all these stakeholders to um, approve them, so that you don't have to go through that approval process to use them in the crisis moment. You just put in the facts and you get them out. The second step is media training. While in a perfect world, you might want to have a singular source or a couple source spokespeople, depending on the size of your organization, especially if you worked for a large global organization that I did in many of my um, roles. I may be far away. The crisis might be in California while I'm in Denver. So I had to make sure that I had operations employees who were media trained, who had this crisis response kit at their disposal and could implement the first moments of our crisis response before a crisis team could be assembled. Again, this is about that speed and accuracy. I can't stress enough that speed and accuracy are the two number one things you want to think about in today's environment. So those are, I think, critical steps. And then there are products, so you don't have to do this alone. There are a lot of crisis communication experts out there and tools that are at your disposal. Again, depending on your organization and size, there are websites that you can become a subscriber to, where you can have an access and resource to some of these pre-written documents, and they can help you write them in real time, kind of with like AI assistance. So I think if that's how and again, not everyone needs that level, but I would think some organizations would want to consider that.
Yeah, and I think, by the way, the internal communications professionals for organizations are arguably the more important ones in a communication plans. Because I have said, and John and I talked about this before the recording, I believe that the employees are your primary audience in any crisis matter. And I don't care what the organization is, I don't care what the industry, the size and scale of that one there. If your employees are armed with the understanding of what you're doing and how you're doing it, they'll be able to convey that to your customers, to your donors, to your supporters, to your business partners, and the general public through word of mouth and other means from that. So internal comms are important. I think the first thing they should do is to understand in conversations with other people within the organization what your inherent risks are. Every organization has one, whether it's military and forward deployed operations, or whether you're in manufacturing, whether you're in retail. Every organization has inherent business risks. Something could go wrong that could disrupt operations, could cause people to question the reputation and the sincerity of an entity. And if internal communications people understand what those are, and then what the marketing and communication, the external folks may be communicating, you can align an internal communications plan to have at the ready, to know what you'll generally say, who will say it, and how you'll say it to your staff, to your internal stakeholders. Because again, they're the ones who you're going to want to inform first. If they're armed, the rest of it becomes a little easier. And I've seen situations where organizations have that reverse. They go external first through a press release or some social media post, and the employers are caught flat footed. So all of a sudden, the inbound phone calls come in, and the team member's like, I don't know what's going on. I really don't have an idea. And in doing so, the problem becomes a question of credibility to the external stakeholders to go, well, if the staff doesn't know, then do these people really have their act together? And it can be completely avoidable if you plan accordingly, align the internal communications to what the disaster recovery, the risk management team is thinking about, and what your external comms are already preparing for. You can set something up accordingly internally, and that's vital in my opinion.
For sure. So again, it makes sense that you want to prep for these things before they happen. But there may be a situation where that time just isn't there. Maybe something pops up that your crisis communications plan works for one type of emergency, but this is a different type of emergency that you weren't foreseeing and you haven't planned for. So those internal communicators that may be in that moment where they didn't have that time to plan and now they need to react in the moment, how should they go about that?
I think the first thing you need to do is to find out what's going on, the who, what, where, when. And then in terms of what you communicate to your internal audience, to your staff members, it becomes a function of telling them what you know, only what you know, but in the same time, recognize in your messaging how this is probably making them feel and what you're going to do to either tell them more when you have it or what you can least tell them to do in the process. The two things in any crisis matter that needs to be conveyed right away is empathy and action. And the staff members, the fear of the unknown becomes a dominant trait, a dominant emotion. And so internal communications needs to convey whatever the situation is, how they might be feeling, and what you're going to do to help them get more information at a time that you have it available, and what they can do in the process. And that means you've got to coordinate with somebody in the C-suite and the leadership capacity to understand that, and have those communication lines established with the internal communication folks and the rest of the organization ahead of any crisis, so you know who to go to, you know to call, you know to find out the information, and set up then your messaging accordingly. So have those communication lines established and convey any thoughts that you have to with empathy and with action. And that's a good watchword for anything that might pop up that's unforeseen.
The other mistake that organizations make when they're in the middle of a crisis is they think they need to get all the facts before they say anything. And again, that can harm speed and accuracy. So if you do have an organization where they're a smaller and they have not built their crisis plan yet, what I would stress is they operate in phases of sprints. Crises are moments of sprint activities, and what you want to do is collect as much information as you can and what you know in the early moments and distribute that information as quickly as you can so that you're at least getting out the early parts of your response. And then the second step of that is you set expectations when your organization will be able to make its next update. Um, I'll use an active shooter example as a where because unfortunately these have been very common lately. So if you had a an active shooter situation and it's in that real moments where things are happening very rapidly, my recommendation is as soon as possible you get that first information out. And so that would look like it's more about public safety and what you know. So it's going to be, we have an active shooter situation. This is the location. This is what we know. Law enforcement has been notified and is on site or is coming. And then you set your expectation. We will give you an update in 30 minutes or something like that. Then you give yourself 30 minutes. You start collecting your next sprint of information. What are you going to do? Um, you know, are you going to set up a media location? Um, you know, how are you going to notify employees? Uh, are there casualties? Do you have to get HR involved to start thinking about how are you going to notify next of kin if there are employee casualties who may start tuning into the news? So you've got that 30 minutes. So then you're building towards your next response. In this circumstance, I think it's very wise for organizations to allow the law enforcement to take the lead in all frontline communications, right? At this point, it's become a crime. It's becoming a criminal investigation. And I would recommend that the organization allows the law enforcement agencies to be the front and face of the crisis. You can work in partnership and provide them information, but then behind the scenes, it's working on your internal part. Like I said, the impact to employees, getting grief counselors, reaching out to grief counselors, getting them mobilized so that you can manage what will be the days and weeks of recovery for the organization. Once the news crews go away and everyone leaves, the organization that's impacted has the trauma to deal with. And so that's the final stage of your crisis comms, is really the recovery, the of managing the organization through the trauma and bringing it through.
So, to wrap things up, I'm going to ask a question that I like to ask a lot in this series, especially with the topic of crisis communications. There's many public examples of people doing them the right way and people doing them the wrong way. So, we'd love for you personally, whether it's maybe with your own company or just examples you've seen online and with other companies, give us an example of someone that did a great job at crisis communications. And then on the flip side, we'd also love to see an example of someone who didn't really pass the bar when it came to how they handled their crisis.
you know, actually, the one that I applauded just recently was Cracker Barrel. You know, the Tennessee based restaurant chain. It's home style cooking type of board affair that you see at truck stops and different other entities like that along the interstates. They came out with a new product on a plant based meat sausage type offering, and it was really interesting how a lot of their social media comments, the people who logged in and expressed their opinion on their social media posts announcing this new product, were supportive of it. But there were hundreds that were absolutely against this product and stated such. And what I really appreciate about that is you can tell internally the company huddled together, discussed how they were going to respond, and they seemed coordinated on the external front as to what they answered it. And they answered it with empathy and action. They said, "We appreciate the fact that uh, people enjoy the traditional menu items, and they can still get that. And for those who want something different, we're happy to offer both, and we're grateful that we can basically accommodate both types of tastes for anybody of any side, and that's how we will move forward." And you can tell just from that messaging that they had their internal communications locked in pretty well, because they came out with united front very quickly from that doesn't happen and stay days later very much intact without people huddling internally and knowing what to say and bringing that out there, because I guarantee anybody who walked into a Cracker Barrel restaurant, the servers knew what to say, the store managers knew what to say, and all of the other people that are involved in day-to-day operations at one of their locations certainly knew what to say. Because if they weren't, we would have seen chinks in that armor days later. And so I think they handled that extraordinarily well. And I would submit to you that without knowing the internal workings of Cracker Barrel, they certainly had their internal communications at work as much as they had their external communications. Now, one of the ones that I always talk about that didn't do it very well is one that goes back a few years, but it was United Airlines. If you remember, they had a passenger that was removed from a flight in Chicago because he refused to give up his seat. And everybody on that plane, as law enforcement, forcibly removed him and actually had a physical altercation, had taken their phones out and had recorded this guy being dragged off there. And United, unfortunately, seemed to take the tactic that you would have understood 20 years ago, which is they put out a press release and said nothing else. They didn't certainly talk to their internal staff and tell them what to say the next day as passengers were going to the ticket counter to check in and all of that. And there was great confusion during the day. And you can see that because of the way in which interactions were occurring at the ticket counter, and people then taking their phone and shredding their frequent flyer cards and recording that and posting that on Facebook and things like that. That's a prime example about how they were one dimensional in their communications, forgetting their internal audience. And in doing so, their market share plummeted for days. The only reason I think in some cases United bounced back as quickly as they did is because they owned some of those established air routes. They basically are the ones, if you wanted to fly to Denver from, say, San Diego or LA, they're one of the dominant ones there, and then O'Hare and things like that, because they've got major hubs there. But otherwise, it certainly was not a great example of that. And in fact, I think it's an example of what not to do, and particularly not involving your internal communications. Those are the ones that I go to. One very recent and one that I still think is very relevant, even though it was a few years ago.
What's interesting is when we go back and we talk about that risk assessment and how that can help you know what your worst days look like. Another step that can be taken is what I call preemptive public relations. And so once you've identified your risk, what organizations should be doing before there's a crisis is they should be reaching the stakeholders that could be impacted by one of your potential negative news days with positive information. And what you're doing there is you're trying to build up in the emotional bank accounts of your stakeholders is goodwill towards your organization to show them that you are every day trying to do your business with integrity, character, and with the community's interest in mind. And an example I can give from my personal experience was when I was working for Tucson Electric Power in Arizona in the mid 90s. And this was before I worked there, but in the mid 90s, the linemen started noticing a larger number of raptor birds who were being electrocuted as the city of Tucson expanded out to previously rural desert areas. They were noticing when they near the power lines that they were had hawks and eagles and owls, and so different large raptors. And the reason why they were susceptible is because they could touch two wires. If that's when a bird touches two wires at once, an overhead power line, that's when they can get electrocuted. Well, they could have easily just tossed those birds into the dumpster and just let it go. But they notified their leadership. Leadership took notice of that. They went to the University of Arizona and they sponsored a study about the behaviors of the raptors in the Tucson area. That study revealed that in the March, when usually raptors are doing their nesting, they were picking power poles to do their nesting, and that was when they were most susceptible to raptor electrocutions. That prompted the Tucson Electric Power to develop a raptor protection program, and they developed these special rubber guards and other materials that they could put on the poles near raptor nesting sites. This created a 75% reduction in raptor electrocutions in the Tucson area. So fast forward, I'm working at Tucson Electric Power in the early 2000s, and in southern Arizona, bald eagles are a rare occurrence. And we had this time in the spring where there were these bald eagle sightings, and it was so exciting for the entire community that on one day, I'll call him Baldy, he was on the front page of the local newspaper. Guess what happened the next day, Gina? He got electrocuted by a power line. Here's where the magic comes. So the next day, obviously this is traumatic. Some community groups tried to come out against the electric company, were attacking us for letting this happen. Before we could really even do anything, we had many stakeholders come to our defense. We had the U.S. We had the local game and fish department, we had the University of Arizona, and we had all these stakeholders, community stakeholders, that came forward to tell our story and say, no, Tucson Electric Power has been doing an amazing job for the last decade to reduce our raptor protection and to protect the community and protect our habitat. So this became a one-day story. And that's the moral, and I know this was a long way to get there, but that's how you can manage. We're back to contracts. Flint, Michigan didn't see a crisis coming, ignored it, and then it became a several year long drawn out where now Flint, Michigan will forever be remembered as a place with dirty water. Whereas Tucson is not remembered as a place that kills bald eagles. It was a one-day story, and we had that community support. So that's why knowing where your risks are, your crisis, working strategically to address those. And again, it takes leadership willing to do the right thing, right? To make those investments in the community, to do the right thing before it's a crisis. And that's the best way to me to manage crisis communications.
Thank you so much for joining us today. If you'd like to connect with our guests or dive into the topic even further, check out our associated blog page on www.untitled.com. internalcommspro.com/blog. Until next time, I'm Gina Morbeck.